I mean, why I wanted to write a book like this. And the large question is that I was looking, as a lot of the field has been looking, for ways to understand what seems to be obvious, which is that in the particulars, a lot of what we see happening in the Soviet experience and the Russian experience were actually shared across the continent, across the Atlantic, and ultimately globally. Meaning, if you focus, if you zero in on things like practices, David has been an influence in this. If you zero in on the productive meaning of modern institutions, Chris has been a help with this. Then you begin to understand that when you look closely, rather than simply see something as different and sui generis, you can begin to understand that there is a basis for comparison. Likening to some extent, and I do that, but contrasting if need be. But the point is they're on a shared spectrum, particularly when it comes to the question of practices and the operation of power in a modern polity. So taxes seems to be the perfect way for me to do this, because similar fiscal systems are being established everywhere, more or less at the same time. Notions that we had that Russia was outside of the norm or behind with the times was actually not true. The capstone of any modern tax system is the income tax. It was introduced in the United States in 1913, Russia in 1916, France in 1917, Britain in 1906, Prussia in 1893, the German Empire in 1913, and so on, and so on, and so on. There's nothing exceptional about what Russians are doing. And all of them, you want to talk transnational, they're all reading each other. They're traveling to each other's capitals. They're reading the parliamentary proceedings. They're reading the legislation. They understand quite well what the others are doing, how they can borrow from them and use them in their own context. And the borrowing is mutual. It's a shared international conversation. And it allowed me to talk about how, in terms of the operation of power, and in terms of the kinds of systems in which we are produced and in which we live, are not exceptional. But that would not be enough, because then there's the other obvious statement, which is that Stalin does not look like Churchill. That the Soviet Union does not look like the United States. Meaning, in some ways it does, and in some ways it doesn't. So I had to go to that next step of saying, taking all of these practices. Now, the great advantage of using someone like Foucault, who focuses on power, is that you can really zero in on one particular time and place and understand how it operates. But the disadvantage is that it's only that time and place, and it sometimes lacks that larger constitutional sense, which he's aware of but doesn't always explicate, which is what are the boundaries, what are the coercive limits, what are the boundaries to any discourse. And that has more to do with the wider context. And then I make some statements here, but especially in the book, about why I think the Soviet Union is different, looked at in a different way. If you take, in other words, if you take a certain step back. So that distance and that comparison allows you to liken, but it also allows you to draw these contrasts. Ultimately, what I'm arguing here and elsewhere is that the Soviet case is different, not because it's not modern or outside of modernity, but because in certain ways it's hypermodern. It is trying to achieve, here and now, a very real unity of all, of everything, and a real denial of boundaries, internal boundaries. And that this made for a different kind of power, and it made for a certain kind of, in particular, unmediated power. It would be tempting to liken this to the totalitarian school. You could, I wouldn't, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have Yanni here. He's not only an outstanding scholar, but a very good friend. And I think he's given us with this paper exactly what we wanted, and that is a general theoretical discussion of the state, which goes beyond Russia, even though that's his area of specialization, to discuss more generally what this meant. And when we were planning this series, the CHR program committee last year, we actually were hoping for a 2-year series to, for the first year, have more general theoretical discussions of the state, and then in the second year have specific cases. So this is really ideal for our purposes. One of Yanni's major concerns, of course, is what differentiated the modern state from pre-modern states. And I think it's useful to discuss, perhaps in a little more detail, what we mean by early modern, modern. I won't get into postmodern, but I guess that's what we live in today, but that's even harder to define. In European history, of course, the early modern period is usually dated from the 16th and 17th centuries. And we see here a number of important developments and changes, one of which is just the expansion of state bureaucracy. Our colleague here at Ohio State, Jeffrey Parker, has called the military revolution what was going on in military terms and what was driving this change in terms of state formation as well. Essentially, with larger military units, new armaments, new fortifications, and so forth, there was this greater demand for revenue, which in turn spurred greater state apparatus to actually collect that revenue. This time period also sees the rise of cameralist thought. Cameralist thinkers were really the first to link state military power with the economic capacity of the population. So you have this important shift from governing territory to governing people and economic resources. And a lot of things flow from that, including greater concern with health and productivity of the population. One of Yannis' major points in this paper is that in fact modern states are looking at individuals, not just at territory. So then moving on to the modern period, the 18th century in European history, this is of course the time of the Enlightenment and French Revolution. With the Enlightenment we have this, for the first time, this notion of a science of society. It really wasn't until the 19th century that social sciences fully developed, and along that regimes of information that Yannis talks about in the paper that would be proved crucial to new systems of taxation. But this, of course, is a very important change. And then with the French Revolution, a whole host of change, including various modern ideologies. But I want to focus on two things here. The overthrow of the monarchy displaces traditional conceptions of power as the exercise of a unitary will. And secondly, of course, the introduction of popular sovereignty as an ideal that would replace the sovereign himself. Yannis highlights how the legitimacy of modern states flows from or rests with the people as part of this ideal of popular sovereignty, and in some ways that the state actually even becomes a people. So this is part of the sort of major shift that occurs at that moment in time. One of Yannis' very important contributions is to portray Russia as part of more general international trends in terms of modern state function and modern forms of taxation as well. For those of you who are not Russianists, let me say a little more about this. Yannis touched on this in his introduction as well. There is this long-standing trope in Russian history to look at Russia as somehow anomalous, usually, as Yannis said, because it was somehow backward, that it was not modern. This is a kind of counterpart to what we see in German history with the Sonderweg thesis, the idea that Germany followed a separate path, that somehow did not develop liberal democratic institutions the way that France and Britain did, and therefore this is what led to Nazism. In the Russian case, people are trying to explain the origins of Stalinism, and oftentimes this is portrayed as a function of Russian backwardness. Sometimes people go so far as to compare Stalin's purges with the Oprichnina of Ivan the Terrible. You'd think this might have been something of the past, but just there's a new book just out by Arch Getty of UCLA that essentially is working along these same lines. So for Yannis to show that Russia actually is following a very similar trajectory to other modern states is a very important contribution. And it also makes a broader point that in Russia and elsewhere, with the rise of modern political systems, it's possible to see the person, the individual or citizen, not just as a victim of state power, but actually as being constituted by it, or in Yannis' words, quote unquote, realized in state practices and as the conduit of power. So here we have state power as not just repressive, but as productive as well. In taxation, Yanni uses the example of self-assessment. When you're thinking along these lines, you look at certain things in Soviet history, like the concept of working on oneself and self-criticism. Often these are seen as sort of repressive state mechanisms. Well, they actually appear very differently thinking in those terms, that this is part of the process of making modern citizens who are actually going to contribute to society and, in a sense, be part of the state as well. Well, one thing you may be asking yourselves, and Yanni sort of already raised this question, if Russia was following these general political trends, why did it turn out so different? Why was the Russian political system a communist dictatorship? Why the horrors of Stalinism and so forth? Yanni addressed this briefly in his introductory comments, and even though his paper is mostly on the late imperial period, he does touch on this at the end of his paper, where he talks about the utter disintegration of 1918 and the opportunity that that gave for full integration or full merging of the state and the economy and the state and citizens. And this is something that Soviet leaders actually did in fact seize upon this particular moment when you had utter social and economic collapse was a moment when they could build up a state that would be, in fact, all-encompassing. I think the historical conjuncture here is very important. And I think in addition to this economic and social collapse, we need to keep in mind that this was a moment of total war, that the Soviet state was born at the nexus of World War I and the Civil War, and that these practices of wartime mobilization actually became permanent features of governance within the Soviet system. Now, this may sound different, but in fact, if we look at what was going on in other European countries during World War I, this was really not so anomalous, because all the major combatant countries engaged in economic controls. Some introduced grain requisitioning. You had widespread systems of surveillance, including proliferation of letters going on. As the morale of the population became so important in this era of mass warfare, it really became crucial to try to somehow manage popular moods, survey the population, introduce censorship, introduce propaganda, and so forth. And you also see in countries throughout Europe internment camps, the internment of enemy aliens. These practices of use of concentration camps was widespread as well during World War I. Now, of course, the difference is at the end of the war, these countries step back from these total war practices. But the Soviet state goes right into another war, the Russian Civil War, a fight for its very survival. So it seizes upon these total war practices, and it actually institutionalizes them within the new Soviet state. You see Soviet institutions such as Gosplan for economic planning and control are established, the secret police, which carries out surveillance, the Gulag as well. All of these sort of total war practices become permanent features of governance under the Soviet regime. All right, just one more point I want to make, and then I'll stop so we'll have sort of maximum time for discussion. And that is the role of specialists in state formation and in the expansion of the state. This is something that Yanni has dealt with elsewhere. He doesn't really discuss in this paper, though I think he may want to include it. Yanni's first monograph was on agronomists. His new book focusing on economists, statisticians, and so forth. There are a number of other Russian professionals and specialists as well, including public health people, doctors, social hygienists, teachers, educators, and so forth, who all had as their goal the uplifting of the population and the modernizing of Russia. Modernizing not just in the sense of industrialization, but in trying to fight these high rates of infectious disease, infant mortality, illiteracy of a largely peasant population. And they saw this as a very urgent goal one that they, in fact, hope to help carry out themselves. Now, most of the Russian intelligentsia, of course, detested the Tsarist autocracy. But here's where Yannis' distinction between government and state is very important, because even though these people hated the Tsarist government, and in fact blamed it for many of the ills of Russian society, many of them actually hoped that a strong, progressive state might actually facilitate the social transformation that they were looking for. And in the absence of strong civic institutions, in the absence of a strong popular mandate to carry out this sort of transformation, the state seemed to provide a mechanism by which they might actually carry this out. Now, this is something that was different. This is a way that Russia was different from Western Europe, where you have stronger civic institutions, a larger middle class, and so forth. But if we broaden our comparison further and look at other countries, other late developing countries, including not only those in Eastern Europe, but we look at Japan, the Ottoman Empire, and later Republican Turkey, Iran, Mexico, and so forth, you see a very similar phenomenon where you have professional people, highly educated, aware of what standards are like in the West, and wanting to somehow modernize their country and their population, and with some sense of trying to uplift the people as well. You see that that in fact the Russian intelligentsia was not anomalous at all. That it was very much following along these lines. Most of these professionals were not Bolsheviks, not Communist Party members, and yet many of them went on to become Soviet officials and actually played a prominent role in the Commissariat of Health, in the Commissariat of Education, I'm assuming as economists, the Menshevik economists and so forth, playing an important role in fiscal and economic policy in the Soviet Union as well.
90% of the finance commissariat was holdovers from.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you see that it's not just, Communist Party leaders that have these sorts of ideals, but actually the intelligentsia as a whole that wants to carry out this social transformation, wants to uplift people and actually make them into conscious Soviet citizens who are going to actually participate and be part of the state. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you both so much. Let's open up the floor for questions and comments, discussion.
Let me ask Yanni to kind of follow up. In other words, David has gone back and forth on the transition from late Tsarist to early Soviet. And I wonder how you, and we end with a 90% continuity in the fiscal regimes. I wonder, what's your, could you be a little more explicit about the transition between, say, 1910 and 1930, and the level of discontinuity and continuity in tax structure, a structural analysis, how that taxation system is working in the late Tsarist versus the early Soviet.
Nice. Okay. Do you want me to answer now?
Well, we can let it go and see what happens. Or do you want to respond?
I can.
Yeah.
Well,
Please do.
So the structure, the fiscal structure in 1930 is modeled on the fiscal structure of 1913. Right.
13, 1910, okay.
Yeah. Which in 1913 is modeled basically on the 1880s.
Yeah.
I mean, the foundations are laid there. So that in terms of the structure of revenue, by 1928, so it wouldn't be different. In fact, it's quite similar. With similar issues at stake. Now again, you're going to tell me, if you can't say these things are the same, and I'd have to agree with you, they're not the same. So there are similar practices. The people who put together the Soviet fiscal system after the Civil War were the very same people who wrote the same laws in imperial times. They're the very same people. Nikolai Nikolaevich Kudlev, Konstantin Nikolaevich Kudlev, the two brothers, Yenzil, Ozerov, these are the same people writing the same laws and telling the Bolsheviks, this is why you need this. And the reason they say why you need this is because war communism and this total system that you established of nationalization, allocation, rationing, and so on, that this system had produced unmediated power, right? It necessarily creates violence. Because when you go to collect something from somebody, there's no deliberative institution and no procedural practice that could mediate your power when you encounter somebody, and mainly peasants they're talking about. It necessarily leads to violence. And in the beginning, the Bolsheviks are willing to listen, and they let them basically reconstitute the same physical system. So, du sachons, but it's not the same. It's not the same. And I think really what's changed is partly what did happen during the Civil War, which in turn relates to what had happened in 1905, which was utter disintegration. As David pointed out, a sense that yes, we are pursuing a universal. Every modern society is pursuing a universal. Universal economies, universal states, universal societies, cultures, works, all of these things are universal. Our choice is the state because it's the one institution that coheres. Culture falls apart on class lines. A nation, we don't have one. We have too many. Right? Society, class, estate, it's all divided by the state. That's universal in Hegelian terms. So it becomes a state-centered system. So that even in late imperial times, they're beginning to think in terms of power, exercised as a practice through the fiscal system. Power is your way to directly encounter your citizens and then assimilate them. And that's why they don't only go to the individual and say, pay your taxes. They go to the individual and they say, practice taxes on yourself. And that's the key distinction. And that they get from Germany, for the most part. And they're developing it more or less at the same time. I mean, the person who develops it in Germany, his name is Hensel. The guy who develops it in Russia is Genzel. It's the same kind of I mean, you know, they don't recognize our boundaries, you see. So, Prussia, I meant. So, and what's different is that by the time we get to the Soviet times, by the time we get to the Bolshevik Revolution, and it is a revolution after October. October is not the revolution, it comes later. The revolution comes in 1918, where they nationalize everything. Now you could say, well, here's the wartime crisis, the circumstance. You know, what are they supposed to do? They had to get grain. They use all this ideological hogwash, but really what it's about is they needed the grain, right? Which I don't buy, right? They did need the grain, but there are different ways to get the grain, to say. What they conceived of was you create a space of inescapability, and you create a space where everybody is a part of that same project. So that there's no way to say, no, I'm going to leave the state now, enter civil society and affirm my rights. This had already been dismissed in 1905. There's no way of saying that I exist in a family unit. Ever since inheritance laws, there is no family unit that doesn't include the state. Right? The state is the universal co-heir. Right? And who introduces that? The America, right, in 1909. Right? And then with the corporate law, which says that corporations are human beings, are persons, and therefore they can be taxed as persons progressively. And then they take that precedent and apply it to human beings in 1913. So all the groundwork has been laid for this. But they refuse to recognize, beginning in 1905, but the Bolsheviks definitely, on all levels, they refuse to recognize that there's a difference between a person and power. Person and power are not opposites. Right? So what happens after that, I think, is the real rupture, and this is the real departure. And the Soviet Union really is different, in my opinion, when it comes to this. That this is the only regime which claims...
After when?
After 1918. 1918. Right. So the economy collapses, production collapses, and really what's happening is that they can't feed the army, they can't feed the workers, and the bureaucracy. So how are they going to get the food? Well, for them it was already made, there was already an understanding that the way to do it is you achieve what every European wants, which is complete unity. We've wanted this since the Enlightenment, but we're the first people to actually do it. Right? So you create a space in which you've nationalized everything, actually statized everything. That it is not nationalization, it's statization, and they're explicit about that. And if you've created this space, then there's no way to escape your obligations. Everybody's a part of the whole. So taxation is a way of the machinery working well within itself, but there's something outside the machine pushing it. Right? There are no levers. Everyone's inside the machine, and it's working nicely now because we all belong. Okay, well, half the population is starving, but aesthetically, this is still pleasing. Right? Not the starvation, the unity, right? The unity. It doesn't work very well. It works very poorly. It's a war, right? But this is very pleasing. It's our final unity, and we've done it, and we're the first ones to do it. Now, you could say, well, 1921 is a new economic policy, retreat, right? Well, they've gone back, they've made concessions, and they've reintroduced private property. Not so. They never reintroduced private property. They make concessions by a license system to people, for people to use state property, but it's never their property. Oh, you're gonna tell me, wait. The first thing the Bolsheviks do when they come to power, they nationalize peasant land. They stateize peasant land, nationalize peasant land. But then they redistribute peasant land, so isn't that a concession? Well, yes, but fundamentally no, because the land does not belong to the peasants, it belongs to the state. This was well understood, which is why the state can come and take whatever it wants afterwards, you see. So you could say, well, wait, you know, people have their private lives. Well, not quite. I mean, the apartments in which they live are state-owned. The beds on which they sleep and make love and reproduce, these are state-owned. Or sort of like, ultimately, these are state properties. Meaning, everything that you do happens in this one unbounded, unlimited space, which is why the state can then come in and say, I want you to reproduce this way and not that way. Why I have the right to tell you to raise your children that way and improve them and make them healthy, because you're part of the state. You were never outside of that, you see.
So the problem is this a great transformation, or is this the realization of the dreams of the intelligentsia of the late 19th century?
Or even the late 18th.
Well, I don't want to go quite that far back.
If you're implying, is it people's choices? I would say no, but it's also not the question I'd ask, right? There is no choice about this. I mean, I don't think citizenship is about choice. It could be, but it's not always. If that's what you mean.
Well, I just mean that is this system as a structure, do we see a real discontinuity, or do we see a realization of possible outcomes of what effectively, you know, your and David projects have been, which is to level the playing field across Europe and across the essentially the Atlantic world, across the world. The modernizing world is all engaged in the same project, and the Russians took on that project to a certain extent.
Yes, I think that's how we put it, and not only that, this also explains why so many Europeans thought it was a good idea, right, and became fellow travelers and communists, right, because they could see that this was one possible outcome of what they've been dreaming of all along, right. But it's only one possible outcome, and so far we're in the land of theory and, you know, very broad strokes. But if you historicize it, you have to explain. I have to explain why did it take this form and not another form? Why did socialism become a state project? It didn't have to be.
Can I just build on those questions too? Just in the sense that you're talking about this then as the project of the intelligentsia as well, and a European-wide phenomenon. Of course, the Bolsheviks are also defining themselves as anti-intellectualists, and in fact offering something that the intelligentsia are not. And then building more on John's question too, what's the response? I realize there's a coercive element here. They don't have a choice. But surely we can somehow retrieve how citizenship, as it's being constructed, the people en masse, how are they now conceiving of this unitary body? Are they referring to the state, or is it simply regional Soviets, and that gives them some sense of statehood? How do they perceive this?
In terms of the terminology they're using?
Yes, that one. Yeah.
So certainly, particularly in the Civil War period, the references being made are Soviet power, and we just have to consider what they meant by that, which is what you're suggesting. And it's not obvious. Soviet power is an unbounded sense of power. It lacks internal boundaries. That's why it's Soviet power and not some other power. Bukharin writes about this. In the economics of transition period. No, actually in the ABC with Davidozhensky. He has to say it 3 times. He said, you don't understand. You know, when we say we have transformed power, we mean to transform. We have not, he said, we're not little boys who took a marble from one pocket and put it into the other and called it a revolution. And he said, we transform power. It is not the same power as before. And they keep going. They say, you don't understand. When we say we've transformed everything, or we're going to, we mean it. Right? That's Soviet power. It's not changing government. Right? It's not changing names. It's not plus ça change. You know, it's just, it really is. And the way he explains it in the economics of transition period is that, you know, the deep violence that accompanies this process is a part of the process of exercising and realizing that kind of power on each other and on ourselves. So in this mix between, you know, the abstract proletariat and the individual proletarian, the proletarian who's taken, for whatever reason, is put up against the wall and shot, has just helped make a better proletariat. So it was for his own good. And he begins to use the reflexive voice in his writings, and the impersonal voice in order to talk about how individuals pertain to something bigger, even at the expense of their own death. So, state. Trotsky by 1919 has become this state fetishist. Everything is about the state. Everything, he keeps saying it, the only way we're going to do this is through state power and the state idea. Gosударственная idea. And he starts using this imperial term, государственность, the statism or statehood, as this is the only way we can do it, because nothing else works. So the state, in other words, becomes the space in which whatever it is you want to talk about has to take place. Class struggle is taking place within Soviet power and within the state. It's not class struggles, anti-outside Soviet fighting against Soviet. Everything is within Soviet power. So even when we're dragging off people for treason, and we read them the death sentences, it is citizen so-and-so.
So there's a sense too that they're masking that expertise too.
They're what?
Masking expertise. This is pragmatism, rather than the intelligentsia's expertise.
See, I don't rest. I don't use the intelligentsia in all of this. There is expertise, and economic expertise, and fiscal expertise, and political philosophy.
Right.
And it happens at the universities, at the ministries. It happens at the local offices, of the tax offices, and so on. And these people are really trained in Hegelianism and trying to think through how you not only dream of a different kind of state, but actually practice it and live it. And when the Bolsheviks come along, these are not dreamers. They're the men of action, right? And so they plan to carry it through. They're anti-intellectual in that sense. But Kudlev, for example, was equally active. He sharpened his teeth. His first job in the Ministry of Finances was to go down to Turkestan, colonial Turkestan, and introduce modern tax practices. Because he can do it there, but not in Central Russia, you see. A good colonial story, right? And he did it. He took the cadastre that had been carried out by Hoffman in the Imperial Army, and used it in order to introduce much more careful income assessment, which didn't exist in Central Russia. Then he came back to Russia and started introducing his practice in Russia itself. He becomes the director of, and then a minister, and so on. So they're practicing. So I don't think there's a separation here between what they think would be happening. What they're doing is creating spaces where something is going to happen because you don't have a choice. These are taxes. And this is not the vote. These are taxes, right? You know what I mean? That's what's beautiful about taxes. You can't negotiate them, right? You know? Not these ones.
Yanni, I'm wondering about going back to Marx here. How strong the presence of Marx himself, and as distinct from. I mean, I realize it's hard to distinguish Lenin from Marx after a point in that world, but insofar as he is still distinct, and obviously the well-known idea that the state ultimately will wither away because we'll have no need for one once we rid ourselves of the contradictions of a capitalist world. To what extent did the partiocrats, who you, as you might call them, see themselves as the temporary custodians of this world who were essentially presiding over their own imminent demise? That is, they are their own gravediggers in a way, and gladly so. Or did they foresee a future without a state? I mean, was there any sense of that there? Was there a kind of eschatology in this Soviet world?
Are there any other questions along these lines? Back to me. So, there'd be a two-part answer to that. Oh, first of all, an answer to your question. What I wanted to mention, sort of an expert of this kind that creates the object of its analysis. So the tax process was creating a certain kind of citizen and payer. And because it's an obligatory process, we then act out the role and we become what they want us to be. That's what happens when we fill out our tax forms, on a most basic level. So with Marx, so there are two connections that I make. I mean, the way that it comes into it. So most of these experts that I've been dealing with, and the economists, and the political philosophers, tend to be Hegelians, and tend to be left Hegelians. And they believe that there's a certain point in which the civil society and the state intersect. let alone the family. There's a certain point where they all come together in the universal, but it's not permanent, it's not always, and it always has an after. Okay? And Marx says, become frustrated with the cyclical notion.
Yeah.
And so the early Marx, we spoke about it before, I think also, was frustrated with Hegel because he couldn't understand that we don't want a unity which is philosophical and sort of abstract. We want a unity which is lived and real all the time. And what he was talking about in particular was that every one of us should become the bureaucracy. Right? There shouldn't be a separate bureaucracy. All of us should be capable of carrying out state functions. That would be a true unity. Right? And at that point, I'm not sure that he's Marx is being a Marxist or a left Hegelian. Right? Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
he doesn't have to be a Marxist before Marxism.
He claimed he wasn't a Marxist.
Totally, yeah. So you can see where this is leading,
Yeah.
right? So the next part is to what extent are Marxists in Russia living this? And I think if you look in the right places, you're going to see that they're living it every day. Anecdotally, I can tell you that I'm looking at these documents. It's a published document from 1918 in the lower Volga in the city of Kazan. And the old tax inspectors were being brought together. And the old tax inspector's job was to mediate between the demands of the central government and their assessment of what the population could pay. That was their job. They can never be good at it because there's no information. There's no data on what peasants are producing. But they try. They guess and whatnot. But it's a sort of paternal and intermediary role that they're playing. So the new commissar comes along and says, boys, it's a new time. Right? Trotsky just declared the food dictatorship. And we really need people to carry out what we tell them to carry out. So your job is to go and actually tell them that when we say fill out your income tax form, you won't believe this, but they're shooting people for failing to fill out forms. The food is secondary in the first instance. Right? The taxes, fill out your forms. So take a point of them, go into the villages, and tell them to fill out their forms. Right? I mean, this is Kafka, right? But it makes sense. And so the inspectors, trained under the old regime, they've all been retained, are saying, well, actually our job was always to tell you, power, what is actually feasible in this context. You don't understand, everybody is now in the state. This is Soviet power. If the peasants have a problem with this, they can tell us. We don't need you as an intermediary, we need you to enforce. The peasants will work it out for themselves. Meaning, we're calling them citizens and they can speak for themselves. And in this sense, there's a merger of what's supposed to, so what's a Soviet? A Soviet is the sum total of the population of a given sub-territory. That's what a Soviet is. It's not the executive, it's the sum total of the population. It has an executive, but that's not the Soviet. So in this case, you're drawing everybody in through this new notion of power, which is, as Lenin says, top to bottom and all across the territory, right? So the frustration is expressed particularly in Lenin in 1917, the State and Revolution, which many of us dismiss or admire as his most utopian track, right? And it's here that he talks about the withering of the state. Now, it's not accidental, right? Because the state is withering before his very eyes because the country is disintegrating, right? And so he's saying that not only could we know that this was going to happen because we're Marxists and we're scientific and we can read history, but this is actually a golden opportunity. So the state will wither, and we're going to help smash it. And that's why we're going to seize power and use that power to destroy itself. The part that I think has been misread, generally speaking, is the next part of what he writes. Because he's not quite saying the state will disappear, not in the sense of withering into nothing. The state will become everything. And it's in that sense, in other words, it's in the limited sense of the state that part will disappear. And what you're left with instead is the expansive notion of the state. And that's where he describes this new syndicate where everybody's an employee, everybody can fill out forms, it's the easiest thing in the world, just issue some receipts. And here Lenin becomes this nerd. So an accountant carrying a gun, which is really, really scary, right? But you know, meaning literally, I need to keep track of everything, I need to issue receipts, and if you don't have them, I will shoot you on the spot for squandering state property, right? But there is this sort of, really boring bureaucratic aspect to Lenin as well. But the state withers to the extent that it becomes all-encompassing.
Everywhere and nowhere.
Yes.
I had a question. You were referring to the peasants and how they referred back to the state and how they could have a voice in the state. How much did that actually occur during the early Soviet period, that the peasants actually had a voice?
Well, I mean, their voices and their voices, and so I think they did have a voice. So they're brought into a situation where they're encouraged, particularly in the early years, to express themselves and to perform state functions at the local level. And it fails for the most part, following which they're punished severely at the latter stages of the war, communism, and the Civil War. But the idea that they're supposed to express themselves and particularly perform certain things and act out certain things, this never goes away and it continues all the way through. And it can be very scripted, as in, yes, I agree that the Marxist reading of the international situation requires that we double production, or and they'll read the scripts. In other cases, they're actually saying, yeah, we should contribute more. We need to have the army. We don't want the whites to come back, and something like that. And that's less scripted. But if we're looking for expression, it's always there. If you're looking for choice, that's a separate matter. And that may or may not happen. If you're looking for free expression, I don't think you'll find it. Right? But I think it's doubtful that you'll really find it anywhere, right? If you look at it that way. Because we're always performing. We're always scripted in what we do. Yes?
Thank you, first of all, for this really wonderful, very interesting paper. I was particularly struck by your discussion of the transnational influences on the structures and the systems of both the Tsarist and the Soviet state, the intellectual foundations and influences. I'm wondering though if you see the practical influences of coming from the transnational realities of globalized economy in the late Tsarist and in the early Soviet period, the expectations of foreign policy in both states. I mean, while the Soviets hoped to build their system completely divorced from the rest of the world, the realities of international economics produced a very different system. And is that actually, is that also an arena where there are the transnational influences that you see that we can tie into the economists and the experts?
Soviet period.
In the Soviet period, also in the Tsarist period, but the Soviets, of course, are doing something different.
I mean, it does tie in. I mean, there are a few ways in which it happens. So, who educates the next generation of Soviet economists, but the imperial generation of Soviet economists? So, I mean, this is anecdotal, but it's actually suggestive. So, the two Kutler brothers who were brought in from the imperial administration, they're noblemen. They're Lutherans. They love Lutherans to run finances in imperial Russia. If you look at the ministers, almost all the ministers are Lutherans or non-Russians. But they thought that Protestants were honest. And Orthodox weren't. And so they're brought over into the 1920s. They continue to run the same apparatus and write the same laws. And when they die, their children take over in the commissariats. The Kutlers brothers, meaning the second generation of Kutlers. There are three of them. And they go all the way through. But then they're training others and so on and so forth. And part of what they're learning is about Western fiscal economics. They insist in the language, almost the identical language that was used in, say, the year 1905, is still being used in the year 1955. And it's in this particular connection that the purpose of taxation is to train people in citizenship and remind them of their citizens. The taxation is never divorced from our particular goals at the same time. So one of them is to remind people, so that all the way through Soviet times, when it didn't seem to make any sense, fiscal or systemic, everyone is still paying income tax, and it would show up there. And there was a question, this American specialist came, and he said, his name was Franklin Holtzman, he was an American tax specialist, sent over to study Soviet taxes in the post-war period. And he said, have you heard the name?
I knew him.
Oh, yeah?
He was a Tufts. He worked upstairs with me.
Oh, I got to talk to you about it. Yeah. And he came back, do you remember that article of his where he writes, he said, I don't know why, but they still have an income tax. It makes no sense. And he said, all I can do is repeat what they told me, because it doesn't make sense to me. The purpose of the income tax is to remind everyone of their citizenship, right? And there you have it, right? Well, if he had read the imperial material, he'd know that's a carryover. So that's one. So taxes always play a certain ideological role. Secondly, taxes are always used within any system, and they learned this from imperial times. You can use it in order to affect one or another outcome or affirm one or another value. So that the other tax that goes all the way through, from mid-Stalin all the way to the end, is the tax for not bearing children. And this is pro-natalist, right? It was in order to raise population numbers. So if you didn't produce children, you had to pay extra taxes. And so that was another notion, that even though we have this final system and a total system, you can still use taxes as a device and as a disciplinary device within the system, and also an educational device. And then other aspects of the system actually begin to depart from any other practice because of the nature of a planned economy and full state ownership. Because it produced this quandary: why would the state tax itself? And their answer was it still performs a disciplinary function, which is why we maintain them. We can discipline the system from within to do certain things and not do certain things. But there was this philosophical discussion that began in 1918. You know, how can the state that owns everything, tax anything? Does that sort of answer?
Somewhat. I mean, I was in some ways more interested, and I don't think I was phrasing my question very effectively, but if there are practical lines that can be, if the state was actually structuring its policies, thinking about the world beyond its borders as well as the world within the Soviet state, if there was, if they were at all taking into consideration the fact that the Soviet economy needed to exist within a global system, not just be responding to the wonderful idea that taxation produces citizenship, or taxation is the ultimate way of expressing one's citizenship.
Yeah, I mean, I have answers to that, but it doesn't come out of this material, right? That there are, I mean, the idea of economic autarky does produce this prejudice in the Soviet Union that they need different rules. But there's also an awareness that they never quite figured out value. They never quite figured out exchange. And that maybe they still need to be following developments elsewhere and use those practices at home to produce one another outcome. But it's paradoxical, because it is true. You know, why would you introduce certain kinds of taxes when you already own everything? They're worried about inflation. Why are you worried about inflation when the ruble does not have a value, when the ruble is simply an accounting mechanism? Why do you care about inflation? So there are these paradoxes all the way through. But my starting point would be the fact of autarky from the 1930s, which induces them to think that they're operating in their own system.
Just a question. I teach non-U.S. and we've had the federal income tax for about a century. And for the first 30 years, the fraction of the overall population that paid it was low, but they had to supervise everything. They had to do all the reporting of the income. The government didn't calculate any of it. You may already know this, but I'm interested in whether or not there's a parallel Soviet experience. In the mid-40s, going forward, the federal government became ever more involved in doing all the calculations for it. There was most of the real supervision of what you're making becomes a state function. And so all you're left with by the end of the 20th century for most people is this very residual thing where you take the numbers the state gives you and you put them on paper and submit. Is the same thing going on in the Soviet Union? Right? So it withers away self-supervision, but there's still this purely symbolic act by the
It withers not only there, but it withers almost everywhere. So it always begins as, it's almost like a device, and they're kind of being cute about it. They say, well, we want you to be a part of this process. We want your opinion about all of this, you know. kind of like, you know, have you ever dealt with a dean or something like that? And say, what do you think about that? But they don't actually care. It's that kind of thing, you know. And it's a modern institution. That's how modern institutions function, right? You're given the illusion of choice, right? So and then you willingly act it out. So when it comes to the income tax, it's partly because it's a real necessary device when you're talking about self-assessment, for example, and the commissions that exist locally to administer taxes. And it's necessary because the statistical apparatus to begin with is staring into a void. They don't know where to begin. But if they can get you to put something, anything on paper, and sign and swear to it as an oath, then it gives them a starting point, and they begin to investigate. And when they find that you're wrong, they can actually bring you to account. So it shifts the burden of proof to you. So it does have that statistical purpose as well. That's information gathering, in other words. But the other idea, and this is stated throughout, everywhere, that the purpose of the income tax in the beginning is only to tax the very, very high strata, modest amounts. The cost of collecting the early income tax is more than the revenue it generates, right? And this lasts for decades. But it serves this political function of making everybody accountable, particularly the wealthy, which is then universalized to make everybody accountable. Once you've moved away from the very small strata, then you need a mass apparatus of some sort. So in England, the same thing happens. They begin with these commissions, where the good old gentlemen of a particular shire or county, as the case may be, would come together. And they form these tax commissions. The assessor would come through, and they would deal as a separate entity between the assessor, who represents Westminster, and the commission, which represents the county or the shire. And it would be a negotiation of separate parties, you see, which was a way to affirm that there is a separateness between payer and state. This disappears, I think it's by World War II. And when this happens, then it's lost its intimacy, and it's become a bureaucratic process. There's an argument made by Martin Daunton at Cambridge that this is actually makes for the dark side of modern British government and the welfare state included, because it loses this intimacy and it loses this sense of participation, which, although it may have been illusory, was still necessary to give you the feeling that you're a part of something and you're playing some part and you're not just being imposed upon. And then he makes the further argument that it's this sort of decline of modern government into the impersonal state that makes for Thatcherism.
Very illuminating helpful. Thank you. One brief follow-up. In the American context, one other function seemingly served by continuing to have people fill out the forms, from the point of view of the right, is it reminds people how much they're paid. And is that something peculiar to the American system or Western systems and so on? It stokes resistance to further taxation, because when people look at these aggregate numbers at the end of the year, they're not always pleasantly surprised.
No, they're all, from the very beginning, they're saying this, across the board. The United States, the United States, a lot of debates happen at the state level when it comes to state income taxes. But when the federal tax comes in 1913, these become a national conversation. And also, it actually begins with the corporate income tax of 1909. Right? And so they're making the case that all of these have didactic, propaganda, publicity purposes. So that when you fill out your form, you're becoming conscious, you're imbued with the spirit of your society, of your polity. And that you yourself can understand that you're fulfilling your obligation. This gives you a sense of civic pride. And there's supposed to be a sense of civic pride underlying the payment of taxes. And I don't think this is entirely vapid. And it's that moment, and then it's also that moment when you realize that you as a person exist within something. And that includes receiving the categories and so on. But there's another function, which is technical but important, which is that filling out a tax form is a form of narking on your fellow citizens. Because every time you list a deduction, it's someone else's tax bill. And so the finance offices use this to gather information on who's received money. We still use this device today, right? When you report certain deductions, you have to write the tax ID of the person who received the money from them. Now, the purpose of this in the narrow sense was simply to gather more information and catch evaders. But the other function of it was to really break down solidarity, social solidarities. So that it's not us versus the Treasury. It's everybody against everybody. And as the French keep putting it, it's sauve qui peut.
By the way, in the American context, it becomes a mass tax during World War II. So that comment about being sacrificed, it seems strongest during periods of national security emergency.
Yeah.
So, and I suspect the same is true with brick. It seems
Yes, well, all of these taxes are escalated with every new crisis. So in Britain, it's after the Boer War. Russia, it's after 1905 and the Russo-Japanese War. But it could be revolution, it could be also, in Germany, it's also about welfare state provisions.
Let me quickly ask, Dave, there is a Civil War income tax that is rescinded, right? Or there's
Well,
no,
it lasts, and then it goes away after the war.
Yeah.
It was an effort to revive it in the 1890s, and the Supreme Court says you can't do that.
okay.
I have it here, on the computer. Abraham Lincoln's income tax.
Because I just thinking about one, just really quickly, and then we're gonna jump, the Civil War is kind of like the American War in many ways, so.
My colleague and friend at Princeton, Shogner, wrote a book about Japan and the history of savings campaigns in Japan over a long period of time. And he makes various comparisons with a lot of other countries too. We haven't said anything here about savings, but one of the big methods for raising revenue in Japan is savings campaigns. Some of them are merely hortatory, but they become essentially, from a social perspective, mandatory during the late 1930s and through the 1940s. And I don't know whether the Soviet state would have needed such a device. You didn't come in, Lauren. I just wondered if you could say something about it, and or what had been happening, let's say, in some other parts of Western Europe during, say, the World War I emergency and the Second World War.
Savings, you mean like bank accounts?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there are these campaigns. So there's the two ways that I've encountered it. One of them was that a savings campaign actually allows for the mobilization of capital because you can then invest and so on using those savings. And so because Russians were so afraid of any institution and anything in writing, but it wasn't just the Russians. I mean, look at France. They use their mattresses, right? And so you want to get them to come to the banks so they can be constituted and mobilized. Right? So it's essential, in other words, to investment, number one. Number two, if you can induce people to put money into bank accounts, then it ultimately becomes visible, and then you can tax it. You can't tax it if it's under the mattress. And then you induce this to happen, and so they have this Sberegательные кассы in Russia, which is this institution of mass saving for people, not the state bank, but under that. And so this becomes a huge operation, and it gives interest rates to force people to induce people to put their money in the banks. And you can insure it also, which you can't do if you put it under a mattress. So all these things are devices to get people to put the money in the banks. Now, these are guarded from the 1840s by a device called commercial secrecy, which exists everywhere in different forms. And the point was to give people confidence that if they put the money in the bank, it will be a confidential matter and others won't know about it, not their neighbors and not the government. And this is closely guarded. The big debate in 1905 is precisely over this issue, meaning isn't commercial secrecy and credit secrecy, aren't these things actually ways of people hiding wealth from the state, particularly wealthy people? Wouldn't it be more effective for a modern state to have full transparency where everybody knows about everybody? And they go through the process in 1905 of repealing commercial secrecy in order to make taxation possible. So that secrecy and confidentiality become associated with shirking and tax evasion, and less than civic. Now the argument was that we're creating this tremendous space where there'll be no escape and everybody will be going after everybody, which is the dystopian version of it. The utopian version of it, which comes from Ozerov, the economist, he's saying, but it's more perfect this way. Look in the West. Look in the West. In the West, everybody already knows about everything because they have credit rating agencies, right? And they give credit scores and so on and so forth. They wouldn't even do business with you if you weren't listed somewhere or dealing with credit. So they do it through civil society, we're doing it through the state. The outcome is the same, it's transparency.
Interesting,
So I was really attracted to this idea of the intimacy of the fiscal system that develops at some point of time. But listening to you talk during the seminar, I was really struck how top-down the whole thing is. It's actually experts who are defining the terms of the encounter between states and citizens. And I'm wondering what sort of intimacy that would be. And actually, do we have any way of knowing how this intimacy is perceived on the other side of the spectrum, bottom up, right?
Yes.
So what I'm wondering here, I mean, taxation has also been studied as an aspect of nation building, not only of state building. So I'm wondering, I mean, is there a connection? I mean, there is obviously a connection, but is there actually a distinction between taxation as a project of nation building and taxation as a project of state building? And if we look at it as a project of nation building, are we able better to get to this intimacy? Because then we actually have to ask ourselves, you know, who is part of the nation, how is that nation constituted, how are people being mobilized behind that nation, and so forth. So, I mean, I'm wondering, I mean, if you can sort of like elaborate on how you conceive the notion of intimacy in fiscal terms, or, you know, the fiscal terms of the state articulated in intimate terms. If you can sort of like talk a little bit about, especially in the imperial period, I mean, this slippage perhaps between state and nation, or is it a distinction, or is it a slippage?
So, again, that last part, these are actually very good questions. I have had to think about them already. I don't necessarily have satisfactory answers, but, the last part, about state, nation, inclusion, exclusion, and so on and so forth. So, one way or another, we're dealing with a universal category, and be it the nation or the state. Meaning it's assumed from the very outset that these are categories which I mean, it's tautological. These are categories which will implicate state power. The word they like to use is zainteresadas, implicate, draw in, make people interested, but it's not interested, it's actually drawn in. We're going to make them implicated in state power, and make them a part of state power. It's going to necessarily cut across our pre-existing boundaries, so that if you have a direct relationship with the state and you function within the state, then the fact that you're a woman will no longer matter. Okay, women don't vote in Russian elections. We'll pay taxes, and that's just as good, right? Because it's a way of giving them citizenship. It's the same argument that is used with African Americans in Mississippi during Jim Crow. They might not vote, but they pay taxes, and that's an honor, right? Except that I think the Russians were sincere, whereas the Mississippians were not, right? Meaning they really believed it. So this was how you implicate. And there was the argument that, well, wait a minute. Women, right? Women are not prepared for this. They exist in patriarchy. They're just going to throw them out there. They're going to be eaten alive by the state apparatus. They say, whoa, wait. Either you think they're human beings or you don't. You know? And the end result was that women would be subjected to all the same things and would vote in the same commissions and practice in the same commissions as everybody else, because otherwise it would be to demean them. So it's the state, but not the nation. And it's Russia. What nation? Meaning Russians? No, it's not a Russian empire in the sense of Ruski, right? It's Rossiyski. Is it the social? There is the social. There is the economic also. Those come into play, but not nation as a universal whole. I mean, nation is finally introduced by the Bolsheviks, but as a particularistic category, not as a unifying category. So there is a distinction, and I think it does matter. And one of the reasons why I think it matters, and this is sort of my meta-argument, although I do make it, is that, you know, if you only see unity in one entity, which is the state, and if in the end, by the end of the story, state, economy, and society have become coterminous in different ways of talking about the same thing, but explicitly so, not just by slippage, but explicitly so, then there's no possibility to resist. You can't step back into the nation and say the national interest is not the same as the state interest, or the social interest is not the same as the state interest. And this is what I'm thinking about now when it comes to that. And in terms of intimacy, it's paradoxical. It's the term I use in that section of the book is that it's systematic intimacy, which should be an oxymoron, but it's not. So it manifests itself in the sense that in the beginning a few people, and ultimately more and more people, are required to sit down and share information that they had once considered to be private and personal and intimate. How much money do you make? How many children do you have? How much have you spent on your children? Did you contribute to a charity? What was your expenditure and what was your income? Are you married? How many wives do you have? And so these are all the questions that are coming into it. And this information wasn't so much that it was private, but it was beyond the concern of state authority. And what's different about the modern period, and we see it happening in Russia, and we see it happening with all of these fiscal systems, is that now these are the concern of state authority. It matters, in other words, one way or the other. That is intimate in that regard. It manifests itself not only in the fact that once a year everyone has to sit down and fill out these forms, and you can find them in the archives. As I told you, in the American case, you can go see what Abraham Lincoln wrote down in his income tax form in 1860, what was it, 3? But then you also have these commissions where, let's say that this is our pool of taxpayers. 10 of us are elected by the collective. We're elected. We're sent to sit down around a table and pore over the very personal information that everybody submitted in their income tax forms and contribute more of it because I know that you made this much. I know that you build a new shed behind your shop, and that must mean that you have more income, and then you use this as a device to start investigating what you wrote down in your. So that is quite intimate, I think, in that sense. Yeah. But that disappears over time.
What disappears?
That sense of intimacy, meaning
People accept it, in other words.
well, it's more that they, the bureaucracy steps in and takes over and begins to perform those functions. And there is something lost there. I mean, there was a time when we used to sit down neighborhood by neighborhood and go over each other's tax returns. I don't know if this is good news or bad news. But I think it was intimate. It's intimate mainly in the fact that it hadn't happened before, that information had once been beyond the concern of the state.
Well, I'm wrestling with this problem posed by this book, Robin Einhorn, American Taxation and Everything, where she broadly compares a northern system and a southern system. And the northern system is very intimate. I come into your house and I poke through your stuff, and I write it down, we argue about it. When we take this back to committee, we argue about it, and we assess whether you built that shed and that you bought those 15 head of cattle. Whereas the southern system is simply a flat tax imposed by the House of Burgesses or whatever to make sure that slaveholders don't pay as much tax as they should. And this is the essence of a very simple model. But in other words, there have been periods of shall we call it, assessment intimacy. There have been I'm thinking of, essentially, there's an argument about New England institutions that they were in fact very modern for their time. They were hyper modern for their time. And so I just keep wondering about there's this constant model that we were someplace and we became something else. And we collectively have a problem here, which is you believe, and Chap Kusimba will come in and be talking about ancient East Africa, and we have to be part of it's the same conversation. So what I'm wondering about is how can we kind of stretch ourselves, while you're here, kind of stretch ourselves a little bit and think about how do we deal with the problem of taxation. And actually, you are a witness because you went to this conference in Florence. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to put you in southern Italy, but I put down your but you were a fly on the wall and then a participant in a discussion across the entire Mediterranean Western world, or Near Eastern Mediterranean Western world, about from Mesopotamia forward about taxation. I just wonder how are we going to deal with the problem of incorporating in a volume, which we're going to argue about around this table next year, incorporating a whole swath of terrain, and your problem is taxation. I'll just put this out there. Maybe the ancient empires were more modern than we think, and maybe the Dark Ages were indeed dark. and there was a period of recession, and there was a period of a regression toward more territorial forms of taxation, I'm ready to be critiqued on this, but I'm just throwing it out there, that what we assume is an inexorable march from pre-modern to modern is something that actually happened from the Middle Ages forward, and something else. There had been waves and complexities, and how do we deal with the variation in the human past? Or is the modern utterly modern and there's no way out of it? And we just relegate everything else to a big lump?
Well, I have 4 answers for you.
Good.
With varying degrees of usefulness. The first one is that I know nothing about ancient East Africa, and I won't even try.
No, I'm not. And I'm just the general problem. How do we get ourselves out of the
The second thing is it has to do with our subjective position of someone who not only lives in a modern time, but also studies a modern time, such as myself. And we're convinced that we're different about everything that we do. And this is a historical reality that we have to grapple with as well, I think. Meaning, ancient East Africa will always look different because we're so convinced that we're different ourselves, right? And that's a historical truth. It's worth exploring, I think. And that's part of being modern. We're infatuated with our own novelty. And as you can see, I'm not saying this is necessarily true. I'm saying that this is how we are. And I can't get around it, nor I think I should. I think I should get into it and figure it out. The next part is that when it comes to, how are you going to deal with the state, given that I'm doing something specific, and I'm saying, well, it always means, raising that next level of method and theory, and not focusing too much on the specifics and trying to figure out, is there any shared conversation to be had here, which brings me to the United States. There I have an answer. And here is that, the American fiscal system has always been torn between different extremes, and it always tries to have all at the same time. So the American fiscal system in particular, at the local level, was always based on regressive property taxation, right? Regressive. This is made possible because of particularly and peculiarly American concerns about privacy and liberty, whereby you did not want to allow the
Actually, not to talk about the state at all as such, but to talk about personhood as relates to the state, and which will bring me back then to be able to ask the question to all three of you perhaps, certainly to David and Yannis, who I know have presumably thought about this, which is what kind of person is presupposed by the nature of the Soviet state? Because clearly, I think, it's very helpful to talk about power being productive, producing a certain kind of subject, a certain a being who can govern themselves in productive ways that society approves of. Obviously, there's a certain Foucauldian kind of flavor to this. And that makes us think of the Western experience, the Western liberal experience, where really it's about producing free, equal subjects. But you're talking about unity, and you're talking about, is it producing subjects who will then efface themselves in some kind of larger whole? Because if all they are is the physical manifestation of a larger social being or social body, then how is that being a distinct person at all?
Well, that's Durkheim.
Okay.
It's Durkheim's quandary, right? It's not a Soviet problem, it seems to me. I mean, what do you think, Chris? Are you following this?
Probably I know when I was slightly spacing out. I'll be brutally honest with you. Can you repeat what?
Well, it's a board problem.
Okay. Are you talking about?
Basically, I was asking because Yannis thinking in terms of a productive power that produces a certain kind of citizen to be part of this unitary state entity. And I'm asking, given that this is sort of analogous to what, say, a Foucault would see going on in Western liberal societies, producing or inducing a being to be a certain kind of free person who will produce maximally and be an economically productive individual, where freedom and equality are certain considerations. In this world, where unity is the consideration rather than freedom and equality, how different then is the person we're talking about that we're trying to produce through these technologies of power? And again, since I know, I think certainly at least two of you have talked about technologies of power in this context, what is the personhood that's presumed by this Soviet context?
Yeah, I've been mulling on this as I've been sitting and spacing. There does seem to be a certain similarity with the Western model. There is the subjects presupposed here as a subject with interiority, with reflexivity, who takes themselves as an object of themselves and works on themselves. The aim seems to be quite different. The aim is you take yourself as an object of power, you work on yourself towards furthering the state, whereas this is completely absent in Britain, for example. The idea is you're working on yourself for the sake of yourself.
And then the wealth of our nation is purely the aggregate of whatever all the little mini wealths that all the individuals themselves produce. Whereas in this world, the wealth of the nation is the corporate wealth that belongs to the state. So again, a very different kind of end of it all.
Is something distinct from the states. And it's very, very clear when the states co-opts it, as for example in World War I, when the state steps in and commandeers all kinds of dimensions of the economy. So it's the point where about 97% of British food is controlled by the government. But it's very, very explicit that we are going to stop this, and they stop it. And then when things screw up, immediately after World War I, there's a wave of strikes. The government immediately begins using its apparatus again, but it gradually lets go.
What about World War II though? You have the wartime emergency. You have the dream that you can maintain wartime measures as a way of social reengineering, rationing, internationalization, which lasts quite a long time after that. Does that make sense? The welfare state?
Right. I think that what you get after World War I is not a total return to what you have before. And there's always this sort of awareness thereafter of the possibility of the state taking over and assuming control of almost everything. And when World War II comes, this is planned and implemented fairly quickly. And the aftermath is longer. And then eventually you get all roads lead to Thatcher. So I mean, it does raise another question also about the conception of power here. We've been
conception of wealth.
Right, we've been skirting around the sort of the general model of power you're using here. I mean, we're using a broadly Foucauldian model where power circulates. Power is never possessed. It's always kind of fluid. It's always moving. It's everywhere. It's everywhere, but it's everywhere in different ways everywhere. And I wondered if you could sort of
no, that goes to the heart of it. I mean, it again goes to this notion that it's these are institutional regimes where people are required to belong, and what happens in there is that what we're thinking about. So that yes, filling out my form, reporting on my fellow citizen, carrying out state functions, all of these are really, unmistakable ways of inducing me to practice power. To exist within the system. But left at that, I think neither I nor Foucault could explain what's changed from one place to another. And this is, I think, the weakness of Foucault, who, remember, never meant to be a historian, right? So he doesn't have to be. But we do. And so then it goes back to what lots of people have spoken about, which is that, you could call it a discourse, but it is bounded. Right? It does have boundaries. And those boundaries are ultimately coercive. You know what I mean by this, right? We call it a constitution, right? Meaning the limits to what you can do, right? And then also the enablements, the inducements to do something, but also strictures on what you can do. And in the Soviet case, well, it's created a space of where it has to be understood from the beginning. It's complete state ownership. There is no outside of the state structure. We can do lots of good things using that state structure, things that nobody else could imagine. And only we can do this. We can do also very bad things that no one else could imagine. Because it's such a realm of mobilization, because everybody's inside. So where does the coercion come from? It's partly because of the flip side of saying that power is shared and sovereignty is shared is that it allows us to practice violence against each other, which is part of the Soviet story. Which, according to some, would look like anarchy. But it allows us to practice power against each other and encourage us to practice power against each other. Also that the power is unequal, and we have to count for that in simple ways, and I don't have a better way to express it. But there are people carrying guns, and they have the right to carry guns, and they're not in coercion a certain period of time. The secret police, the army, and these things do exist. They are directed by a party which has a monopoly on policymaking, and a monopoly on and that to me is unequal power as well. So that to say that everybody shares in power and sovereignty is not to say that that's in any way equal. There are men with guns, and they tend to be men. Does that sort of answer?
That does, yes.
Let me see if there's one more question, then I'm going to grab the closing moments.
Actually, Yannis was just going to answer my question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just want to make sure I get into the closing moment. But, yeah.
So here's in a nutshell, here's what I've argued, right? That there are competing notions of personhood, and for heuristic purposes, I laid out there's one notion which is largely Anglo-American. This is heuristic, understand, right? It's largely Anglo-American, which holds that we are defined by the extent to which we can be left alone. Our liberty, in other words, and our person is defined by the extent to which we cannot be touched. It's a negative understanding of personhood. Parallel to this, and almost immediately, is emerging, let's call it a Hegelian notion of personhood, but it's also English, right? So it's hard to separate, which is that we're defined positively by our existence within a larger whole, which tends to be, it could be the family, it could be civil society, it could be the state. But we exist as part of it, not outside of it. And these are competing notions that carry through to the present day. Right? So when you look at the Russian case, certainly by 1905, and I have these beautiful exchanges between bankers and government officials, where this Russian banker comes out and he says, "You can't touch my property because it's me." Это моё я. He says, "It's me. It's myself. It's my very self." And they said, "Oh yeah?" And he said, "Well, who gave the definition of self if not us with our laws? You didn't have a definition of self until we did it through inheritance law. Because we define dead people as persons, and that applies to you as well. A dead person has no rights, you have no rights, you're completely transparent, you're completely open." So this goes on. So it pushes Russia in a particular direction, which is to skip directly from that stage of not thinking about persons to thinking about persons as completely transparent and permeable and malleable, right? It doesn't go through that intermediary stage of first declaring that people are autonomous. So there's not a competition between the categories. It skips directly.
Fascinating. So there's no appeal to some kind of natural order of things here in the nature of Soviet personality or personhood. I mean, whereas in the West, you know, we love to think that our market economy and everything is ultimately a work of nature. It's just all, you know, natural individuals realizing their own potentials. But in their world, they realize it's a completely artificial world we're living in here. Totally man-made, totally constructed.
We have that power.
Yeah.
Fiscal anthropometrics. That's the term one they're going to use.
One other thing, Greg, the term they use, new Soviet person, it actually, the goal is unity, but it's not the erasure of individuals. In fact, the Soviets are very explicit. They say, we are for individuals, but we're against individualism. They have an idea that people can only reach fulfillment of their potential if they join the collective. So that's a crucial.
Is it almost like a sort of superorganism type of a way of thinking about things then, that we need all the parts to be there, but they all have to be able to work together, and they're all only realized that they're in.
But it's for people's own good too. I mean, the whole idea of labor camps is that if you take someone who's, you know, a capitalist and make them actually do manual labor and produce something instead of just being bloodsuckers or exploiters, that will transform their consciousness and make them realize the highest level of personhood.
Well, let's do this. Let's go to Chloe, let's go to Jim, and then I think we're probably time to stop.
So this question kind of goes off of what you guys were talking about in terms of the, in terms of the state, in terms of the individual, who determines what power is. So interpret it how you will. But my question is, must power only sanctioned by the state be the only legitimate power, or does individualized power, as many powers of the individual exist on its own? Can it function outside of the state, or can power of a person be considered power if it's not within the state?
Yeah, it's everywhere. We practice everywhere and always. It's practicing your classroom every day.
But that's because you have authority and a mandate. Whereas what we think, I would say your individual power is an individual agency.
Yeah, I guess I'm asking, does individual power actually exist without the overarching structure of the state? Is it? I guess I could go back to the idea of free will, but is power anything if there isn't a state body to preside over it?
This is the Lockean problem. It's the state of nature. But in theory, you know, if you have the authority, if you have authority, you can wield power. If you don't have authority, you can't wield legitimate power. It becomes a form of illegitimate violence.
But I mean, yeah, but it's also, you know, a state which established a terrain or a space in which we can exercise power seemingly autonomously, but it's actually within quite clear boundaries. And in that sense, you know, so imagine your classroom where you've been told that whatever your instructor does is for your own good, right? And you almost act as if you're voluntarily following through on requirements, even though you know you have to do that in order to advance your career and whatnot. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's happening within certain boundaries. And you could emphasize the fact that we have certain freedoms of operation within that framework. You could emphasize the fact that the framework was given to you long before you were born, right?
A similar prism through which one can raise the same question, I think, was articulated by, among other people, by Robert Nisbet when he used to teach at Columbia back in the 1960s, 50s. And he talked about intermediate level associations. And I think for him, this had some profound philosophical, even ontological significance. But that without the intermediate level associations as between the individual and the state, you could not ultimately have the kind of freedom that he envisioned that most human beings would want to have. And so, yeah.
Well, then he also wrote in a parallel, he wrote about Durkheim.
Yes, he did.
Which is that, you know, that society stabilizes. And it makes it possible to dispense with individuals because society will continue to exist, even with the sacrifice of certain individuals. And therefore, this is a stability, and stability for him was a good thing.
I think along the same lines, I don't think that Durkheim ever quite recovered from the death of his son in World War I. So maybe some people's sacrifices are more important than others or something.
Well, I want to bring us to a close, but also open up an agenda for everybody, and this includes this board-like collective that we are working under, which is for some people coerced, some people are in 1725, and you are required to be inside the collectivity. Some of you have been drafted because you were in it last year. All participants from last year have been included. We have a community, this is the CHR, State Formation Community. What I want to do is start a conversation about our problem for a year from now, which is what papers do we put together? And I've been sitting here flipping through my fancy little clear agenda here for about 2 years, and so I'm going to say, just you know, I'm going to propose, it's not a say, it's a propose, that your paper actually fits. I mean, when I talk about Kusumba, I'm also thinking leaping beyond Kusumba to Steve Min, who's coming in early November, to talk about weights and measures and nation building. And I would suggest that his paper is probably going to end up very close proximity to your paper in the volume. And then I'm up, you know, I think we should start a discussion. That's why we have this stuff on the web. That's why we have, but I'm thinking that Julius Strauss's paper from last year about the repertoires of power in Taiwan and post-1949 mainland China also come close in terms of the problem of the Foucauldian sense of how power weaves its way in through complex ways and is structured and imbricated in all sorts of institutional forms that become woven into personality. So I think we should start this conversation, and we should continue it throughout the year. Last time we were with Mr. Pincus, and we really couldn't do that in the lecture format, but now we're in a seminar format. So I'm hoping we can start talking this year more about the relationships between papers we've heard and tensions between papers we've heard. And at this point, I'd like to ask us all to put our hands together and thank Yannis.